lab.
All right, thanks so much. And yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you all about some of the work we've been doing in the catalog program. And I guess with that, I'll sort of dive in. And the way we're going to do the presentation today is I'll sort of start by giving an overview of some of the work we've been doing and just like some of the big picture stuff. And then we're going to go into 4 different like deep dives on different areas that we've been working in that some of my colleagues will give presentations on. So just kind of the big background that probably everybody already knows. As part of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, we were sort of funded and,
Greg, I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit? Can you speak up just a bit?
Sure. So yeah, as part of this bipartisan infrastructure legislation, we were sort of funded and given the charge to conduct research and development activities in cooperation with IOGCC to assist federal land management agencies, states, and Indian tribes in identifying and characterizing undocumented orphan wells and mitigating the environmental risks of undocumented orphan wells. So we initially got this 5-year, $30 million appropriation, and then last year we got another $10 million. And I think it seems like that's also, I think I just heard that we just got the budget like in the past couple of days for the extra FY24. So I think we have a pretty good budget and hopefully we can make some good progress. I guess the other thing to mention that's part of like the big picture is that we have, IOGCC estimated there's between 310,000 and 800,000 undocumented orphan wells. So there's a lot of these things and, as we all know, finding them is challenging. And so sort of like, that's kind of like the macro picture. Like I also oftentimes like to think about like more of like the micro scale picture of like, how does this impact people's lives? And so this is sort of like a cartoonish diagram that we put together of like what we feel is like the life cycle of the undocumented orphan well, where it's, drilled and it produces. And then probably sometime a long time ago, it's abandoned and not properly plugged or anything like that. And then sort of in between then, lots of crazy things can happen. Like one of the stories we always like to talk about is when they pulled out some of the well casings during World War II to try to get the metal. And now we're sort of in this phase of we want to go out and collect data and try to understand where these wells are so that we can characterize them and remediate them properly and sort of mitigate some of the effects. And so, I found it's kind of interesting to just think about the history of these things. Like this picture here is from, Los Angeles County. I think it's from like 1905 or something like that. And you can just see that there's oil wells all over the place. And so a while back, I was out there for a conference and I found out like where that photo was taken. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but where this photo was taken in the sort of upper left. And so this is basically what that looks like now in the lower left. And there's basically like a school there. There's like a football field on top of this old oil field. And it's just like a couple miles from downtown LA. So it's like a very populated area. And sort of like right in that same neighborhood, there was a guy who he could smell, stuff that didn't seem like it should be, didn't seem like it was healthy. And he felt like there was this undocumented orphan well on his property, but he couldn't actually pinpoint the location. And the reason why is because it was like buried underneath his sidewalk. So he dug up the sidewalk and then like, this is what he found. And he pulled off this cap that somebody must have put on there a long time ago. You could see that it was like really cooking. And, this was potentially like a dangerous situation if, opening that up, potentially there could have been like dangerous gases that would have been, potentially even deadly. So like, it's kind of, I don't know, like for me, it's important to think about the impact that these things can have on people's lives. And, hopefully we can help with this problem. The other thing I wanted to mention sort of higher level is, when we first started this project, we did a survey of the states and to understand, what are the priorities and current practices and things like that. And, this survey, I think, was very helpful to us to get a sense of like, the boots on the ground perspective of like what's happening out there. And, it helped us sort of set our research goals and understand what our priorities should be, where we can, develop technologies and best practices that I think could help with these. And of course, like, I just want to mention that like, we don't view this as like the final word on the subject. I think as this orphan well program is sort of like ramping up both within DOE and DOI and with the states, I think we're all going to learn a lot more. And, please reach out to us and give us feedback on the work we're doing or things that we're missing that you think are important. I think we're all really open to that and sort of welcome that kind of feedback. So kind of like diving into some of the work we're doing, we're kind of viewing this as like a 3-stage process. So like there's sort of like 3 stages to go from like we don't even know where an open well is to like remediating the well. And so like for us, the first stage is like things you do before going into the field. And so, there's a lot of different things you could do. We'll talk about 2 of them here today. One is looking at old topo maps from the USGS and other sources that oftentimes have locations of wells on the maps, sort of in like a very unstructured way. And so Fabio will be talking about pulling some of those well locations off those maps and the work he's been doing to do that. And then Greg is going to talk about our tool that we call Ogre, which is a tool for extracting information from documents that we have that describe these wells. So these are documents that are sort of in a very unstructured form, just like a scanned image, and then trying to turn that into a more structured data set that's more actionable that could sort of help us, go out into the field and find these wells. And I'll talk a little bit more about some other things we're doing there as well. Sort of like the middle piece is finding wells with field work. And so like, a lot of the work related to this that we've been doing is related to things like drones. And so Christine is going to talk about some of the field work we've been doing in Osage County. We've kind of been using these methods for sensing information in the field, combining that with machine learning. Obviously getting out in the field is super key to finding these wells. And, we're trying to develop technologies that can help with that. And then the last stage is sort of like after you find the well, there's work you want to do to characterize the well and understand the well, and then of course, properly plug and abandon the well. And so Sebastian is going to talk a little bit about some of the work on quantifying methane emissions from these wells and trying to understand how much methane they're emitting and trying to like drive the cost down for things like that. So going a little bit further into kind of some of the work we're doing about like some things you can do before going out into the field. So as I mentioned, Fabio on the left is going to be doing a deep dive on this subject of pulling information off of the topo maps. So there's like these circles on these topo maps that indicate the location of undocumented orphan wells, and he's sort of developing AI algorithms to extract those locations from the maps and sort of like, distinguish different types of circles on the maps and, like numbers of like a number 9 that also has a circle on it. So it's a little bit challenging, and Fabio will talk more about that. Another piece that's kind of interesting is just to understand historical production can help us, if we study the historical production, it can help us understand at a county level, how many undocumented orphan wells are present in that county. And so one of our postdocs here has been doing a lot of work on that, Ismet Yahan. And so we won't go into that, but that's also something that we're doing today. And then, as I mentioned before, Greg is going to do a deep dive into this idea of extracting well information from historical records with AI. So this is like if you have some form with the location and other information about wells, we're developing tools that can, help you rapidly extract information from that. The last piece I wanted to mention was locating wells with aerial imagery. So we've been developing data sets and machine learning models that can look at aerial imagery. So we've been using like the National Agricultural Imagery Program images to do this. And we've been having some success, at least in some regions. Like for instance, in New Mexico, we've been developing methods that seem to be working reasonably well for finding these wells. And it seems to be more challenging in other locations. But I guess like the takeaway here is, doing this work before going into the field can really help us understand where these wells are and, try to characterize them and things like that. And, like doing these things sort of on a computer are generally like much cheaper than actually going out into the field and like flying drones and things like that. Then once you actually get out into the field, unfortunately, like there's no silver bullet for finding wells once you get out into the field. Like this, so this map on the right is showing like using different methodologies that could be used to find orphan wells. Each of these dots represents like the location, potentially the location of an orphan well. And it's not like the different sensing modalities, just like they all line up with each other. There's some significant disagreement. And so one of the techniques we're looking at is combining these multiple sensing modalities with AI to help us find wells better than we could by just using a single modality. So this is showing like a proof of concept where, if you use two modalities, in this case, it's like sniffing for methane and sensing having a magnetometer on there, you can find more wells than if you just had one sensing modality. And then sort of on the left, Christine's going to do a deep dive into some of the field work we've been doing. And so she'll talk more about that. One thing I would just highlight is we had some success flying a fixed wing drone in high winds and rain when a rotary drone failed. And so things like drone choice could end up being very important in sort of efficiently doing field work. And then the last piece I wanted to mention is in terms of the field work is like citizen science. So we've been developing techniques to help citizen scientists go out into the field with things like their cell phones that have sensors on them, like magnetometers, LiDAR, cameras, that could help us go out and find wells for us. So the last piece is characterization and plugging after finding a well. So Sebastian's going to talk more about this work, some of this work on the left, which is about developing cost-effective methods and best practices for quantifying methane emissions from orphan wells. We've also been developing techniques for characterizing wells without having, putting instruments down hole. Oftentimes people don't want to put these instruments down the hole because you don't really know much about the condition of these wells, and those tools tend to be quite expensive. So we're looking into things we can do without having to put things down the hole. And we won't go into that today, but that's sort of some work we're doing. And of course, the ultimate goal is to properly plug and abandon the wells so that you can mitigate their environmental impacts. And sort of that's the big picture thing that we all want to be working towards. And then just transitioning into the deep dive. So the first one is going to be by Fabio, and he's going to talk about the, pulling information about wells off the topo maps. Then Greg will go into the work we're doing with documents and pulling information off of documents. Then Sebastian will talk about the work on characterizing methane emissions, and then Christine will wrap it up with her discussion of the field work that we've been doing. And so Fabio, you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. And welcome everyone, and good morning. So my name is Fabio Sulla, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the quest of identifying undocumented orphan wells using historical topographic maps. And what we'll be talking about is actually current under review for a scientific publication in a scientific journal. So yeah, please, next slide. Yes, so let's start with the data set. So we wanted to find a source of information for accomplish the task of accurately locating undocumented orphan wells, UOWs for brevity in my presentation, at regional or continental scales. So we discovered that the USGS fairly recently uploaded this historical topographic map collection, which is a set of almost 100,000 georeference maps, topographic maps that cover the entire United States, and they've been issued since the late 1800s. Now, the importance of this data set resides mostly on the fact that these maps are georeferenced. So this means that each pixel in a map corresponds to a coordinate, to a geographical coordinate in the real world. So in particular, we focus on a subset of these maps that are kind of that are kind of colloquially called quadrangles, issued between 1947 and 1992. And the reason is because these maps actually, they've been compiled, paying particular attention to consistency in colors and symbols throughout the entire data set. So this is kind of a crucial part, because when we are using these maps, and I show you how we will train an algorithm to find orphan wells, consistency is a crucial step in component in the data set. And indeed, on the right, you can see that actually oil and gas wells, they are represented consistently as a whole of black circles in these maps. Now, human beings are very good in abstraction capabilities and recognize circles, whatever other shapes in maps, for instance. A machine actually is not. So the idea is that because these maps are just raster maps, we need to somehow surface this information. So and how we do that? So this is the main challenge of the investigation. And yeah, next slide. So yeah, here comes to play artificial intelligence for computer vision. So actually we use an algorithm that I'm showing here on the left in a sort of pictorial way that has been originally developed to characterize biomedical images in order to find different kind of tissues in this sort of images, but has been proven very proficient in many other fields. And indeed, in our case, next slide, please. Yeah, we apply to our maps. And in the same way as we can recognize different tissues, here we want to actually surface a specific object, the circles, and distinguish them from the background. So in order to do that, we train this algorithm by manually labeling around 11,000 well symbols across 80 different maps, and train the algorithm so that it can recognize the circle with respect to the background. And next slide. In this way, we are able to enrich the information present in each map by surfacing this metadata, this information, as I'm showing in this slide. So on the left, you can see an example of a typical quadrangle map, and with this new color showing up that depict the information that we extracted. And the inset is very much explicative of what I'm saying. As you can see that black circles, part of the original map, are correctly recognized, and this is highlighted by the fact that they are surrounded by a blue circle around them, and compared to the location of documented well in official state databases, here highlighted in purple. And when there is a mismatch that here we define as a distance higher than 100 meters between a detected well in the map and well in the official database, when there is this mismatch, we flag this this well as a potential UOW, here highlighted in red. Yeah, next slide. However, as every machine learning and AI algorithm, the algorithm, of course, makes also mistakes sometimes. So here we want to be fair and highlight the fact that indeed sometimes some symbols, here you can see this number 9 in the figure, has been misrepresented, misdetected as well, probably because of the presence of the circular pattern in the number 9. However, we develop a custom script in order to vet each result. And we are able to do around 1,000 UOW vetting per hour. So it scales pretty well, under the assumption that, of course, it's way better to spend just a few seconds of a human being evaluating from remote the fact that a detection could be wrong than not having someone in the field spending potentially hours to reach a well that indeed is not a well because has been misrepresented. So we believe that still the human beings still play a role in this case. And yeah, next slide. And yeah, so once we identify the wells, we can start to, as a first step, even before going into the field, we can do some remote validation, as we figured out that some of the wells that we detected are actually visible from satellite imagery. So you can see on the top part of the slide 3 images that represent a detected well in the topographic map. The same region on Google Maps in this case from Google Imagery, and on the right a zoom in of the same image where the red circle is showing up actually the presence of structure that is actually consistent with the presence of a former well. On the bottom, instead, I'm showing another example, same idea, but today nothing is visible in that area. So we actually collected some historical aerial photos And here you can see that there is actually the presence, of a structure in the area highlighted. And indeed, yes, this is one site that we verified in person, and indeed there was a magnetic signature consistent with the presence of a whale in that area. So yeah, next slide. So here is one nice summarization of our results. So these are all the undocumented orphan whales found in Osage County, Oklahoma, 261 overall. So at this point, we are able to provide the exact location of these wells for either remote verification, we did that, but also for field investigation, which is teams like Sebastian going in the field and going there verifying surface feature, but also subterranean feature, eventually validating the presence of the well. And next slide. So here is a little example in which I'm showing you the symbols are a little bit small, but if you focus on the bottom part of the slide, for the sake of time, we are seeing that actually the orange dots, again, sorry, very small, they're actually almost perfectly overlapping with the presence of a rig, which indeed they are undocumented orphan wells. So this is already a very nice verification that our method indeed is working, is fine in the field. Something that's been either abandoned or not in any case tracked by official databases. And next slide. Same thing for Los Angeles County, as Dan was mentioning before, a pretty crucial area given the presence of urbanization in a very old oil field, 181 wells found there. And next slide. Most notably in Los Angeles, the issues are indeed the proximity with human being and artifacts. So yeah, we literally found wells in people's backyard or also in proximity of hospitals, apartment buildings, schools. Next slide. And finally, we were able to verify, even from magnetometer data, that indeed the presence of the well, even when not visible from the surface, is in average order of 10 meters away from the location of the well identified with the historical maps, validating the fact that this is a great tool for exact locating potential UOWs in the field. And yeah, this is my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Fabio.
All right. It's my turn, Dan.
Yeah, you're up, great.
All right. Hey, I'm going to steal the slides. I think you have to stop sharing.
Okay. Let's see.
All right. Let me know when you guys can see my screen here.
I can see it.
Okay. So this, the focus of my talk is some of the work that we've been doing under catalog to extract data from historic records. So in a way, another application of machine learning. Fabio just gave a really great presentation of what we're doing with maps, and this is what we're doing with old documents. So the idea for this came from the fact that, obviously knowing how a well is constructed, its casings, its cement design, that's going to help you come up with a plugging plan for the well, maybe even characterize some of the environmental risks of that well. And really almost across the board in some states, a lot of these data are not digital, right? So there's lots of great permitting documents. Wells can have, multiple documents filed over their lifetime that describe how it's constructed, different procedures that have happened, whether that's a deepening, plug back, things like that, final plugging, so on and so forth. That's going to tell you what's in the ground. Obviously, we do have a lot of older wells, especially in that undocumented orphan well category. A lot of those wells were installed kind of prior to 1950. It's, if there's no record, there's nothing we could do here, but certainly some of these records go back as far as the 1950s, maybe even a little earlier in some states, and we think there's value to extracting these data and putting them into a machine-readable database. So that's just my overview. I think this slide kind of captures the challenge. A lot of these well data are captured, they're trapped in these records, and we want to liberate them and bring them to a machine-readable database where they can be queried. The quality and the format of these records really vary widely. So I'm just showing two examples from Pennsylvania. One record's from 1957 and others from 2002. These are both well completion reports. They have most of the information that you'd want to know for a well, but the format, of course, has changed completely between 1957 and 2002. I'd say most states we look at have anywhere between 5 and 10 formats for every single document. So that's one challenge. Both of these records are actually pretty high quality. So that top record from 1957 has like typewriter text, but some of these older records in some states we have scribbled handwriting, things like that that do make this a challenge. But there's lots of great technological solutions for this, and I've been working on this problem since probably around 2016, and even in the last, I guess, how many years ago was that? 6 or 7 years, as a guess. We see big improvements in OCR, large language modeling. Some of these machine learning techniques have gotten very, very powerful. So the idea here is to take a lot of these machine learning techniques and apply them to our historic records to see what we can do to facilitate the digitization. So like Fabio mentioned, this is not a replacement for humans. These methods are imperfect, but they can greatly facilitate what we're doing. So that's how we came up with Ogre, the Oil and Gas Regulatory Record Digitizer. There's quite a, I think our logo's endearing. Some might even call it cute. He's the ogre that shows you what we're trying to do here, eat up all these records. We released our first prototype in 2024, and it's been hosted on Google Cloud. So in the interest of getting this up and going faster, we built this tool on top of Google Cloud. Google Document AI, their team has made a lot of readily available, easy to use software that can help digitize these records. But you still need this custom interface, and you'll see what I mean when I show the tool. It's one thing to apply the tool, these different tools that Google has developed to these documents. It's another to create kind of an intelligent framework for processing these and trying to streamline that human review of what we're doing. So we kind of reached out to our network at the time once we had this tool coming together, and Nathan Webb and his team at the Illinois State Geological Survey reached out saying that they were interested. So we started a collaboration with ISGS, and they hired 3 summer interns that have been using the tool. So far, they've looked through about 500 high priority well completion reports. And this has really been a beta test. So we've been iteratively improving the tool, getting feedback from Nathan's team. And we hope that, as we kind of hammer out all these kinks, that, we could be a lot more productive with the time that people spend using the tool. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of the workflow of the tool. So we start with all of the records, or a subset of the records, whichever records you're interested in. In some states like Illinois, these records are collated into a single file. So we've developed functionality for splitting those files out and clustering and classifying the forms by type. So just showing here, 3 example form types that might come out. Once we know the type of well, we actually add a step that I'm not showing here where we classify the individual types. So if we have a pile and we know they're all well completion reports, then we'll group them into, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, however many different well completion reports we have. Then we develop the algorithms that work with those individual forms. So there's like a manual labeling process that our team does. We need about 50 to 100 forms of each type. We tell the algorithms exactly what we're seeing on the forms. And this allows you to pull off kind of this labeled text. So we're getting kind of couplets of information. If it says production casing depth, then we have a number. Those data fields are linked, so we know what it's pulling off. It's not just a list of all of the text on the form. It's intelligently linked couples of information. That's kind of where we're at right now. We have these intelligently linked couples of information. We can export all of those data. Well, actually, I should say we do have the opportunity to review and validate those data. So people can look through these forms, validate them, and then we can export that information to you. but there's definitely some work we need to do on like the data quality validation. So that's something that we've been talking with ISGS about, essentially verifying well depths, data quality types, things like that. So that's kind of coming in the next phase of the tool. So everything I've highlighted here is what we do inside of the web tool. So this is a web tool that you interact with, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And everything we do here, we're doing it outside of the tool currently, but we'd like it, we'd love to get to the point where you could just upload a collated record and all of this would kind of just happen. So this is the current workflow for the for Ogre. You log in with a Google ID because it's a Google Cloud project. You choose which project you're working on, right? So we list out a number of different projects, and we have projects grouped by well report type. And then you can review those records manually. We've tried to set this up so someone like an intern can be working through these records, validating the information, maybe leaving notes for an advisor, maybe like someone overseeing a supervisor of that project. You can export those records and then sign out. So then the reason I grabbed the slides is I want to show you guys how the tool works. So I just got to make sure I'm bringing up the right slide deck here. So, okay, here's the Ogre web tool. Just want to give a bit of a live demo. Can you guys see the web tool, or are you still seeing my slides?
I can see the web tool.
Okay, awesome. So here we go. This is what we set up for Illinois. We have 3 general projects, wells that penetrate Precambrian, the Mount Simon, the Eau Claire formations. And we have a number of different well completion report types, but thankfully some of them are similar enough that we can use the same algorithms for them. So right now we have 2 projects set up for each well completion report type. So if you click on this first one here, you see all of the reports affiliated with that type that are in the Precambrian. You can click on your file, and what it does is it prompts the record to the right, and then you have your field to the left. And it depends on what the tool pulls out, right? But you can essentially click through each of these fields, and it'll highlight where it's at on the form. So here, the well name and number is highlighted where the algorithm is grabbing this. And then it gives you a confidence from the model. So like this one here, it was not very confident that it pulled off NF5127. If that were wrong, you can make an edit and change that text. I'm not going to change this because this is an active project and I don't want to screw it up. But essentially, you can kind of walk through and see, what was the algorithm grabbing and make manual edits to this, right? And then you can, you have a couple options. You can mark these as unreviewed or incomplete, or you can hit next and it marks it as reviewed and complete. And then this is a great example. Here's a report type that was misclassified. So Fabio mentioned this in his presentation. It's true for our work as well. These algorithms aren't perfect. So you can actually make a note and say, hey, this is the wrong report type. And we have options for marking them as defective. So you can kind of see this here, right? This is a defective record. And someone marked this not the same type of report as the others. Ogre's not picking anything up, right? So that's super valuable. All of this information, comes out, and then you can export it as a CSV or JSON. And all of those well fields, right? They'll come off. They'll come off in the download. So we'll open this file up, and I could show you what this looks like here really quick. So I don't know. Sometimes Excel takes forever to load. So we'll see if it actually comes up. But you can export it as CSV. You can export it as JSON. And this is kind of where I'm talking about. This is an area we need to work on moving forward, right? So, here's all of the fields on the record. They come out in a nice spreadsheet. And then when we move to the next step, I think this is going to be more of an iterative process with your data manager, right? So what are the formats that work for your database? How do we get this into a format that's easily digestible for your database? We see certain, certain formatting things come through that maybe are not ideal for your database, like the inches and whatnot. So these are all the fine touches that we're working on now, and we're getting a lot of feedback from the ISGS team on how to improve that. But like I said, there's more iterations of the tool coming, And this type of custom functionality for oil and gas wells and oil and gas well data is what we want this to have. So, if you're looking at, say, a casing width, we know that it's likely to be in inches. If it's 9 and 5/8, then maybe we just do the translation into, 9.62, whatever, to make sure it's make sure that it's all uniform for entry into your database. So I think that's, a good overview of Ogre. I will say I do want to highlight other work going on under the project. So we are working a lot with large language modeling and multimodal large language models for historic records. So these are kind of a newer thing that's hit the scene, especially with ChatGPT, things like that this year. We think there's a lot of promise for using these types of models to pull the data off and interpret them without kind of using such, the approach we're using with Ogre is a little more, I want to say, rigid. So our team is working on these types of models in the background with the hope that we can replace some of the Google tools we're using and essentially reduce some of the cost of running the tool. And this is just an example of what we're doing with OCR. So, if you're doing large language modeling, you still need an OCR component, and there's a team, at Sandia Lab that's working with OCR models. So we hope to implement these types of approaches eventually in the tool, and like I said, replace some of that proprietary backend so that it can be, lower cost for us to use. So, all right, that's it for me. I'll stop.
Thanks, Ray. All right, and then Sebastian, do you want me to drive the slides for you?
That'd be great. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon all. My name is Sebastian Birod. I'm going to talk to you about methane detection and emission quantification work that we do under Catalog. This is a large team effort, right, from staff across Lawrence Berkeley Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, and National Energy Technology Lab. So next slide. And so one of the objective that we have for our work package, which is detection and quantification of methane emission, is to provide the Department of Interior with accurate, cost-effective methane measurements method that can be used to report well emission reduction values through the program back to Congress, and that's a requirement from the BIL language. Some of the challenges that we're facing is that most of the wells, undocumented orphan wells, are low emitters, and there's a large number of them, and which add to a significant contribution to our national methane emissions. The flow rate, historically, when we're trying to do quantification emission, we're measuring flow rate, which is difficult to measure with that complex and expensive equipment, and measuring concentration of methane from those wells is much simpler measurements to make. The low level also of emissions from individual wells is a challenge because it means the detection limit that the sensors that we need to use has to be fairly low. And we cannot use current satellites platforms to really quantify methane emission at the large scales and scale up our efforts. So we need new technologies. We also need to understand the methane emission distribution and uncertainty associated with the specific problem of undocumented orphan wells, right? And one last thing is we know that those wells are living creatures. They're evolving with time, and their associated emissions evolve with time. So there's a little bit of a challenge also when we take snapshots of those measurements, but I'll talk about this a little bit later. Next slide. So one of the things we've been doing is really trying to gather more emission statistics on emission of methane from different type of well, from active well, documented orphan well, idle well, and undocumented orphan wells across the nation. We've been focusing on California, Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Ohio so far, but we're expanding the regional scope of the field work that we're doing. Christine is going to talk a little bit about this. We've collected so far emissions statistics at more than 500 wells. And as you see, I mean, I've put the mean values that we are measuring within that population and the median, because some of those distribution are not Gaussian and a bit skewed. So that's why it's nice sometimes to have the median values. But you see there's a large variability even for documented orphan wells and undocumented orphan wells of emission, right, from nothing to multiple kilos. So that's adds up to the challenge. Next slide. And so what we want to do is we want to really provide quantitative measurements of undocumented orphan well methane emission. We use backpack-based and drone-based measurements because we need to provide before and after plugging and abandonment data to the states. We want to also validate the effectiveness of the plugging and abandonment program, and then provide best practices to DOI, right? And this applies, so although catalog is focusing on undocumented orphan well, but this applies to both undocumented and documented P&A program, plugging and abandonment program. Next slide. So as I said, I mean, the cost of method currently used to quantify methane emission from wells, documented or undocumented orphan well, varies widely, right? From FLIR cameras to high flow sensors from Semtech to static chambers, dynamic chambers, GPM, Gaussian plumb models, vent busters used by some company like Well Done Foundation, UAV-based systems, the method 33 by EPA, and the new method that I'll talk about today, which is called FAST. I'll go. And so that table is really provide you with a, an indication of what the hardware are, the range of emission that they can measure, the accuracy, and is it labor intensive, and are you at a safe distance going to be close to the wells or not, so, which has implication on safety. Next slide. So what we've decided to do is to try to develop a Gaussian plume model framework, which is based on a steady state solution for the advection diffusion equation known as the Gaussian plume equation, right? And that's been used widely in the literature to perform emission inversions. So it's been very well documented, right? So, and you can express, it's basically from measurements of atmospheric concentration of methane and 3D wind measurements, assuming that you're measuring along the plume center line. If you have the source of the emission, the wellhead or the point leak of the methane emission and the receptor at the same height, you can express the relationship between the concentration of methane measured C to the flow rate Q, and as a function of the wind speed, right? That you see there. And so if you make different factors to simplify the equation, basically you can relate emission rate Q as a function of the concentration times the wind speed, the average wind speed, and a K factor, right? And that K factor is something that's we don't measure, but we can estimate. And the way we've been around this is, next slide, is through our control releases that we have, where we have all the methodology and all the uncertainties associated with this test very well buttoned down, right? We know what Q is, we know what we measure the concentration, we measure the wind speed, and so we can infer Q for different geometries, and that's what we've done here. And the innovation that we have for the method that we are proposing and we're going to refine eventually is called FAST, for forced advection sampling technique, where we actually generate a jet over the source using a fan that propagate the flow, in the jet's. You can imagine a stream of methane concentration that goes directly over the sensors that we have here. So in that picture, you have the fan. I think you can see my cursor right now. So the fan is here, the source is here, generated from a blend of methane tank. The height is 1 meter. We're putting the analyzer at 1 meter as well. We use a backpack. We use multiple sensors, right? It could be a backpack mounted system from Picaro, from Aries, from many manufacturers. And then we have an acquisition system, right? And because of that relationship, next slide, we can actually do different control release for different control emission rates. And we did this from 1 gram to 40 grams an hour. and we do, and we measure wind concentration, and we know what the emission is, and we can estimate different K values for different emission of control release emissions. And so what I'm showing here is, because of course we're in natural conditions outside of conditions, and there's external forcing by winds, and in the day we did those experiments, or the multiple days we did those experiments, we had wind gusts up to 10 meters per second. So we had to do a little bit of filtering of the wind that we were measuring. So what I'm showing here is three plots that shows the filter angle that we're doing. For no filters, we're filtering everything coming from the back of the system, or a cone. We're limiting our sampling to a 300-degree cone along the center line, right? And what we see is the relationship gets tighter and tighter as we do the filtering. So because we are really taking only the methane flow generated by the fan, by the jet. And so we can estimate what values of Ks are for this particular geometry. So we find that K is around 0.2. It's unitless. Next slide. And then we can use that K to estimate. So now we have K from the control release. Now we go in the field, we test our approach, and we benchmark against a different technique, right? So that's what we've done at multiple campaigns. We test against an OGI camera, an in-situ air flow sensor from Semtech, the FAST method, a LiDAR-based system by Explorobot, and we use also the Bascom Turner gas rover because that's also a lower cost than the backpack system that we're using. And so next slides. And so we've been doing this at during three campaigns, one in Texas, where we were invited by the Forest Services to really quantify methane emission at 11 documented orphan wells before plugging in abandonments, right? And we did this in February. Next slide. We did this, so February in Texas, we did this in March in Oklahoma, and we use the same approach with the FLIR, Semtech, FAST, and Explorobot. And then the last one we've been doing is in Ohio a couple of months ago already, in May, at the Wayne National Forest. And all those are the slide went a little bit fast, but all those environmental conditions are very different, right? The landscape in Texas, Oklahoma, and Ohio are very, very different, and the environmental conditions are very challenging in some places more than others. And that gives us really a robustness of our method. So the next slide, I'm going to show you preliminary results of what we found. So if you compare and I picked only 4 wells for now because everything is going to be described in a paper that's going to be submitted next month. It's led by my PhD student, Mohit Dubey. And so I'm showing for the first 3 results from February and March. You see that the reference approach that we use, which is provided by the iFlow Semtech sensor, right, the $45,000 sensor, is matching really closely what we estimate really quick with the FAST. So the FAST, eventually our goal is to get a screening method in 5 minutes, right? It should be really quick, much cheaper approach, and to get something from measurements of concentration and wind and screening those wells, right? So the idea of the FAST is getting much faster, much cheaper, lower cost approach. So we see that for the first 3 that we have, the benchmarking works really well. I mean, it's within the error bars. The flow was pretty low. On the 4th one, what I want to mention is it's very different. There's a factor of 7 difference. But what we noticed is that particular well had emissions that were immensely varying over time. While we were there for multiple hours, emissions were going from 0 to 100 grams per hour to 0 to... So, and the Semtech, we do snapshot measurements, 5 minutes, and the FAST integrates over the large, for that experiment, we did this over a large 30 minutes interval. So we integrated more of the variability. So that's one of the challenge also, right? When we do those quantification, how do we take into account the temporal variability of those emissions? Next slide. And so I think our next step for us is really to continue to use the forced advection, the fan approach to enhance the results that we have when we don't use a fan. So we really like the approach that we have with the FAST. The uncertainty in emissions, although they're pretty large, right, compared to the Semtech, they remain usable for a quick screening, because again, the idea is to say, is that well emitting 1 gram per hour, 10 grams, 100 grams, or a kilo? And to really prioritize for plugging and abandonment. We are refining our approach for the wind direction filtering, right, to minimize interference of winds from external conditions, in gusty conditions, in winds that are induced by obstructions and so on. And what we really want to do is bring the cost down of the FAST methods to a few $1,000s, right? Right now, the system that we're using costs, tens of thousands of dollars, but we really want to bring the cost down using more low-cost sensors. And we're doing some tests with a few new companies, like Nikira Lab will just provided us with a new sensor we're testing in the field next month that brings the cost to more than $20,000. But then we want to really get to a few $1,000s. So we're looking into this. We're still looking to expand the scope of the field campaigns across other ecosystem at different time of year, right? Which might affect the result that we have. And then one big thing that I think we haven't talked a lot is really characterize the temporal variability of methane emission from documented orphan wells and undocumented orphan wells. So we're looking for candidate wells where we can leave equipment for months at a time to really understand what the dynamic of those emissions are over time. I think this is my last slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. And Christine, you want to take over?
Sure. How much time do I have? Are we going to 11?
If you need a little extra time, that'll be fine.
Okay.
Going to 11:30, but I think we had you down for 10 minutes, maybe.
Yeah, no problem.
You can stick with that.
Okay, thanks. So hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name's Christine Downs. I'm at Sandia National Laboratories, and I'm leading the field teams, the field efforts of Catalog. And so I'll actually touch a little bit upon what Sebastian and Fabio had described in detail and how those are, sort of integrated into what the field teams are doing, and then talk about some examples from the field data, field campaigns that we've conducted so far. So the names at the top: Eric, Dubé, Sebastian, Andre, Yushin, Matt, and Jacob are sort of like the main players on the field team, but there's certainly many more of us, especially when it comes time to performing field work. The point of the field teams is to, number one, respond quickly to field work needs, whether someone already has some field work ongoing and needs support, or whether there's an area of interest that could benefit from field work, and the Catalog team can come in and do that. Also building a real-world data set for other members in Catalog to test their machine learning algorithms against, sort of as opposed or in addition to the synthetic testing that's usually initially done. And then just curating field data and a list of potentially or confirmed undocumented orphan wells, or I should just say undocumented wells that can contribute to a national database. And of course, all of this is obviously to the benefit of stakeholders that we're working with as well. So the map there is actually a little out of date. There should be a few more stars, mostly majority of them coming from Sebastian and his team's work in Texas and LA. But you can see some of the areas that where either field work has been done during and prior to Catalog, and some areas where we plan on doing field work. So next slide, please. I want to show an example of two areas, one where we've performed field work, that's Osage County, where Osage Nation is, and then Navajo Nation's property on the left, where we're planning on doing some field work. one of the ways or one of the criterias in which we select areas to do field work is, does it help us cover a more diverse range of environmental factors? So on the left-hand side, Navajo Nation is obviously going to be flat mesas with really steep canyons. So, you know, very little to very steep topography, very arid, so not a whole lot of vegetation, versus Osage Nation's property, or Osage Nation's land in Osage County, where you actually have kind of like a half east-west between sort of pasture, flat rolling hills kind of land with some vegetation on the west-hand side, and on the east side, more hilly and more deciduous trees. So all of these different land types that you can encounter just between these two areas of interest all are going to play a role in designing your drone surveys, or in how you're going to quantify, or what the performance of your different methane quantification methods are, like Sebastian had mentioned. Next slide. In the previous two cases that I shared, Osage and Navajo Nations, we established a memorandum of understanding between DOE and each of those entities. And this won't always be the case. It depends on the stakeholders that we're working with. But we did in this case so that we could establish sort of a foundation or a framework, as the slide says, for how we're going to work together, how data sharing is going to work, how we're going to transfer knowledge and lessons learned after each field campaign, and what are like the final expectations from everyone involved. And it just makes the collaboration more meaningful. It makes puts everyone on the same playing field, and again acts as a framework for others to hopefully model. Next slide. So prior to field deployment, as you already saw, there are a couple of ways in which machine learning can really do some sort of preempt work before anyone has to get boots on the ground. And this is an example of Fabio's topo map work that he just shared. So the purple, blue circles that you see in the zoom in of the topo map are just the same symbology that Fabio showed, where you have documented wells as the purple circles, and then the blue circles as what the algorithm is putting out. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what those results look like after the filtering of, is a potentially or a potential well extracted from the topo map within 100 meters of a documented well. And the reason I show well density contouring it for Osage County is just because there's so many. So you can see that there are actually these clusters that may or may not correlate to high density wells from the database, the public database of documented wells. There are some clusters that need ground verification. So the couple of times that we've gone to Osage County, there's been a ground effort, Sebastian being part of that, to verify as many of these wells as possible. And yeah, I'll just leave that at that so I can, next slide. So once we're out in the field, we have our areas of interest that either the stakeholder, in this case Osage Nation, defines for us, and then we have the topo map sort of as a preliminary way of identifying areas of interest. Once we have those, we go out with a suite of drone and multi-sensor platforms on those drones. There's the ground-based surveying. There's a man-plane survey that we performed in Osage that we'd like to perform elsewhere. So let me just talk a little bit about the drone first. I'm showing an example of a magnetic anomaly work, and these are two examples of the types of UAVs you can have. You have the fixed wing, which is the large blue one on the top left, and then a rotary drone on the top right. The type of noise you're going to get from either of these vehicles is going to have a different effect on your magnetic data or any sensor data that you may have that's going to receive the a signal from the engines, from the drones themselves running. So the type of vehicle that you use may affect your data in different ways, and we kind of come up with some way to deal with those. And in either case, the signal from a well is pretty distinguishable. It's these kind of bullseyes that you see there. And in this case, the red is a high positive magnetic anomaly. And then the black dots are data points from the Bureau of Indian Affairs public well database for Osage County. And then on the side are some pictures of what those anomalies actually are on the ground. Not always the vertical wells. In some case, you can get just storage tanks and horizontal wells or a cluster of horizontal wells. But there is no silver bullet, but a lot of folks talk about magnetic surveying as a pretty wise go-to. And so that's definitely what we used in all of our campaigns. There's also a methane sensor attached to any UAV that was doing the magnetic work. And we had Livermore had gone out with a LiDAR and hyperspectral camera as well. And we're still waiting to hear results of the hyperspectral camera, but the LiDAR was very useful in, just obtaining a DEM for future flights for the UAV to sort of plan out, flight planning. But then also, if you have infrastructure at the surface, it's pretty nice to be able to see that, and it's kind of like a secondary way of confirming if your magnetic anomaly or some methane anomalous methane concentration corresponds to infrastructure on the ground or not. Next slide. The ground-based surveying is basically everything that Sebastian already talked about, all the different ways in which they have to quantify methane concentrations, methane screening methods, and then flow rates coming from a well of interest. So part of the ground-based surveying was also verifying those topo map, potentially undocumented wells, in addition to then screening them, and if they were leaking, quantifying those flow rates. Next slide. The manned aircraft, the manned aircraft survey happened after the drone and ground survey, and this was done with polyometric SAR. So if you're familiar with SAR, synthetic aperture radar, polyometric SAR is very similar, just in that your transmitting and receiving channels of your radar have directionality to it. And that directionality allows you to create these different data products that can piece out different scattering mechanisms coming up from the surface. So the image on the bottom right there is the area of interest. That pink is the area of interest that we covered with the SAR aircraft compared to the individual drone surveys there. So this is a nice tool. It's not going to pick up the same anomalies as a magnetic survey will, because if a well is buried, SAR only tells you what's at the surface. So it's not going to give you all the information that a magnetic survey will, but it can cover a much larger area in a very short period of time. It took about 1.5 to 2 days to cover this area. And we had covered another area as well, just not shown here. But it sort of is a nice way to sort of cross everything that's off the surface, just get that out of the way. The magnetic survey is going to tell you more about the buried anomalies. And the image on the right-hand side is just an example of that. The different colors you see are just a function of the different ways in which that radar signal is being scattered back up to the plane. Next slide. And then lastly, I think Fabio had showed an example of some smartphone geophysics, or maybe this was with a magnetometer, Fabio. But we had done some smartphone geophysics while we were out in Osage as well. And a couple of us on the project have done this in various places. I guess it's kind of part of the ground-based surveying, where, if Osage Nation was having difficulty locating a well that is in their database, or if we needed to locate what appeared to possibly be a buried well that showed up in the topo map analysis. This was an easy way to do that without needing any expensive equipment. The precision or the accuracy of your smartphone magnetometer may or may not be as great as a more expensive backpack magnetometer, a more sophisticated system, but it was pretty useful in for our purposes and just, you out in the field trying to find a map that should be on the ground somewhere. And here's an example, at the bottom there's an example of what that anomaly mapping can look like. GPS is not great, so I wouldn't take those track lines too seriously, but the anomaly is pretty clear there. Next slide. So those are some examples of the field work we did in Osage. Again, there's more data coming from some of the excuse me, other areas that you saw on that first map I showed over in West Virginia, Ohio. Berkeley has some magnetic data and methane quantification data from LA. And then we plan on our next large campaign being in Navajo Nation, coming up in the next 4 to 6 months. But there is some post-deployment work that can be done as well. And one of those examples is using that field data, again, to inform machine learning efforts that are happening that need that field data to test the models that are under development. Here is an example of using some machine learning to classify the scattering mechanism that I talked about before from the polyometric SAR. So you can see on one side, you have the SAR image with a derrick, storage tank, an injection well, or a couple of derricks actually, and then a well, which is like just a pipe kind of fenced in. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what the algorithm pulls out. Some false positives there, so that's a work in progress. But this might be a nice way to not only collect a large amount of, or cover a large amount of area looking for surface features, but then be able to pick out oil and gas related features versus other anthropogenic objects that we're not too concerned with. Next slide. And then, magnetic surveys are pretty popular, and for good reason, because the shape of an anomaly of a vertical steel-cased well is pretty distinguishable, but you do have to be careful you do have some post-processing that needs to be done. So one example is performing a reduction to pole, RTP, and then it's actually much grainier than I thought it was going to be in the top right corner there. That's just from Google Earth. But the yellow pushpin in that image is the well database, the database location for a well. On the not RTP is the magnetic anomaly that the UAV magnetic survey pulled up. And then when you perform an RTP, which actually compensates for the inclination of the Earth's magnetic field, which can kind of shift your magnetic anomaly so that it's not on top of the feature that's producing it. When you can see how far off it is, and then when you perform your reduction to pole, which is a pretty simple calculation, you can see how much closer it gets to the database entry. Now, some database entries can be off, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get closer. But this is a pretty important step if it's something like 13 to 17 meters, as is the case in Oklahoma, knee-high or waist-high grass, or if you're in a really hilly area and there's lots of leaf cover and debris on the ground, it can be really difficult to find a well where the location is slightly off. So being that much closer to having an anomaly that's actually sitting on top of the object that's creating the anomaly is pretty important. So I would say that a reduction to pole should be done anytime someone is doing magnetic work to find wells. And then there are other corrections, header correction, high and low pass frequency filters, signal decomposition. I'm showing an example of that in the two pictures. The one that has sort of like more yellow in it is uncorrected. It's nice clean data. You can see where the sort of the bullseyes still are, these sort of hot spots. But if you perform these kind of frequency or signal filtering techniques, you take a lot of the noise out, which in this particular case, the data I'm showing there was because of header noise, depending on the direction that you're going in, and noise coming from the UAV itself. And so when you do those filtering techniques, you can see just how clear those anomalies are, and there's kind of no questioning, where the anomalies are. So next slide. Actually, that's it for me. So there's the pre-work that you saw the deep dives on, which is really important to guiding where that field work happens. Magnetic work and methane work, all sorts of all the sensors involved do involve a little bit of post-processing, specifically that reduction to pole is important. And yeah, hopefully as the time goes on, our field work, our field data set just gets bigger and bigger over time. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. And then I think just the last slide, in conclusions, since we're out of time, I won't really say much, but just mainly want to say we welcome your input and feedback. And since this is a good opportunity for that, I'll just stop right here and open to questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation.